All right, so we're 1900 on the nose, and the games have become very serious. Let's see who we get this time. All right, let's roll the cameras. We're black against the 2050. Okay, this is going to be juicy. This is going to be juicy, and it's going to be a good test of our opening repertoire. We're facing what appears to be the Smith-Morra. No, knight f3. Okay, so this is a slightly odd move order. It's not bad for white. And if you look carefully, we actually can keep this pawn alive with the move e5. I think a lot of people are tempted by that move because you see the knight takes e5 loses the knight to queen a5 check. Actually, the move e5 is bad here because white gets a much improved version of the Smith-Morra with c3. Then you trade on c3, and black has this gaping weakness on d5 as a result. So what you want to do here is essentially play whatever Sicilian you normally play. If you're a knight or a player, then you want to go d6 here. If you're a con player, you want to go e6. We are accelerated dragon players for the purposes of this speedrun, so we're going to go knight c6. And knight takes d4, g6 transposes to the main line, but our opponent is sort of insisting on playing this in rather unique style. Bishop c4 is a weird move. Okay, bishop c4. Let's unpack that move for a second because I don't fully understand it. Our opponent is delaying knight takes d4. Why is he delaying it? I'm not entirely sure. So one approach here would be to play g6. g6 is a totally reasonable move. And after knight takes d4, bishop g7, we're back in relatively normal territory. Of course, this is not really a theoretical move. But I think that we can try to punish white for being, overly cute. Rather than just playing g6 and meekly developing, I think knight f6 is a much better developing move. It's a much more testing move because it directly hits the e4 pawn, and I don't think this move has a downside. Yes, and this, of course, would be the downside, except it falls into a very well-known tactic. Anytime you have a king on e1, and anytime you play the Sicilian, you have to be aware of the possibility of a check on a5. It would be wrong to give that check immediately because after bishop d2, we lose a minor piece. Then our queen hangs and our knight hangs. This is what our opponent is relying on. But a little bit of tactical trickery enables us to apply this concept properly. We can start by taking on e5. I hope this is not some sort of very deep prep. And in response to knight takes knight, very common trick, then we play queen a5 and we're able to pick up the knight. And the difference is when we play queen a5 immediately, the knight still defends the pawn. So we can't take it with our queen. Knight takes e5, and we have already won the opening battle. Another thing to point out, bishop takes f7 check could seem annoying, but remember that we could take that bishop with the knight rather than taking it with the king and allowing white to take on e5 with a check. Oh, queen takes d4. Whoa. Yeah, our opponent, I think, continuing to dig himself into a hole. This gives us a nice choice. So the two candidate moves to me are to take the knight and to ruin white's kingside pawn structure, and to take the bishop and secure the bishop pair for ourselves. I think both options are good. It's largely a matter of taste. The more positional move is knight takes c4 because we cash in our chips and we get a long-term advantage. The more tactical approach, trying to win the game more quickly, I think is to take the knight and immediately go after white's king. I think that we should play this methodically. I like cashing in our chips and playing positionally, so let's grab that bishop while we still have the chance. I also don't particularly like knight takes f3 because we don't have the machinery to actually attack white's king just yet. So it's not like we can immediately launch a mating attack after taking on f3. Here, we also have the follow-up tempo move d5. This seems very natural, just pushing a pawn into the center, grabbing control of the center. Now, you might argue that a move that's more in the spirit of certain Sicilian setups is to push the pawn one square to d6. That's a more modest move, and then you can try to fianchetto the dark squared bishop, but that's a little bit slow, and I see absolutely no reason that we shouldn't grab control of the center. You shouldn't think of this as a Sicilian anymore. This is just a position. And, Sicilian ideas don't necessarily apply here anymore. So let's go d5. And The queen drops back to b3. And I assume our opponent is aiming at the b7 pawn to make it difficult for us to develop the light squared bishop. The move that I think a lot of you might think of instinctually is queen to b6. This is often how you meet a queen on b3 across many different openings, but I'm not totally sure that a queen trade is in our favor. If we play queen b6 and our opponent trades, then we've created for ourselves a new target on the queen side that white can attack and harass with bishop to e3. So I think the sort of not every piece needs to be distributing whatever the COVID vaccine rule applies in the sense that we don't need to develop our bishop immediately. We're not under no obligation to bring our bishop out. And the fact that the bishop remains on c8 isn't such a big deal. We can actually work on our king side first, and then maybe later on we can fianchetto the bishop with b6 and bishop b7. So queen a5 check, by the way, I don't see the point of that move. It just walks into bishop d2. I don't see what we achieve with a check on a5. I think that we should focus on developing our king side. That's the top priority so that our king gets out of the center. And once it does, it'll be easier to address the problem of the light squared bishop. I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to play b6 and then bishop b7 or even bishop a6, but only after we castle. Of course, white could try to open up the center with c4. That's absolutely not scary because our pawn chain in the center is super, super well protected, and white's development is significantly lacking. Okay, so where do we put our dark squared bishop? Again, I think modest development might be the order of the day here. Bishop d6 or bishop c5 may seem like the more active moves. First of all, bishop c5 walks into a very unpleasant check on b5 and forces us to drop our knight back to d7. That's awkward. Bishop d6, I'm a little bit irked by bishop g5, and the pin against the knight could be slightly annoying because later on I do want to be able to move the queen out to c7, for example. So I think developing modestly with bishop e7 is just a little bit more solid because we're already up a pawn. We have the bishop pair. We don't have the need to develop particularly aggressively. Let's just complete our development, and now we can focus on the more pressing issues. So we castle. Of course, we're not afraid of the x-ray against the queen because the pawn on d5 is so well protected. Notice also that c4, which I think is something our opponent might be thinking about, runs into d takes c4, counterattacking white's queen on b3. And it's easy to see that after rook takes d8, c takes b3, rook takes f8, king takes f8, white recaptures the pawn, but he'll just end up a pawn down in a miserable endgame. So far, our moves have been very straightforward. Now we get to the final developmental priority, which is the question of the bishop. We do want to bring it out. There's really only one way to bring it out, and that is to play b6, which we can play largely without any hesitation. c4. So our opponent is unable to restrain himself. He does play c4. And of course, we don't have to play dc. White's not really threatening to play c takes d5. So a good alternative would be to complete the development of the light squared bishop with bishop b7, lending even more support to the d5 pawn. So for example, if after bishop b7, white plays knight c3, we could bring our rook into the game with rook c8. And if you calculate all of the captures on d5, at the end of the day, we just establish a super powerful bishop on d5, which takes the place of the pawn. But let's consider d takes c4, because that's the more concrete approach. I think our opponent, in response, might be preparing the move queen to c2. So d takes c4, queen c2, we move our queen away, and only then, probably white is going to capture on c4. Even in that position, we play bishop b7, and as a result of this trade, our uncontested light squared bishop is on an absolutely ideal square. So I think both bishop b7 and pawn takes pawn, these moves are essentially interchangeable. It depends on whether or not you want to allow an endgame. I don't see a reason not to. So unless this is some sort of a blunder, I think we should play dc, trying to keep it as simple and calculation-free as possible. Okay, so now the question for white, he can take the queen, drop the queen back to c2. Of course, white cannot take on c4 because the rooks are not coordinated. Yeah, queen c2 as we discussed. And in addition to queen e8, which is the obvious move, we also can block the attack on our queen with the move knight to d5, which I also really, really like because that knight is super powerful. It can be supported from behind by the bishop. So yeah, the queen on e8 is a little bit cramped. It is, but not really, because the queen has plenty of prospects along the e8, a4 diagonal. It can move on to c6 later, for example, and build a battery with the bishop that we're about to fianchetto. So again, these types of positions where you have a big advantage, you will often have 2 or 3 moves that are largely interchangeable and that are all within the range of being pretty good moves. So which of these moves do we want to choose? I'm going to take a minute to think about this. Less than a minute, actually. Figure of speech. Okay, I like the more aggressive approach. I think we go knight d5. We establish our knight in the center. And you can see how the absence of a light-squared bishop really, really hurts. Really, really hurts white, because we're positioning 2 of our minors on light squares. And that's why I'm never afraid of the pressure on d5, because I know for a fact that white simply can't add any attackers onto the d5 square. If white had a light squared bishop that, let's say, would move on to e4, yeah, then our knight would be incredibly unstable. As it stands, our knight is incredibly stable, and it will be just as stable if it is replaced by the bishop. So let's continue getting our pieces into the game. Actually, we have, I think, a really, really nice move here, which I wouldn't say forces the endgame, but it forces white into a very unpleasant dilemma, and some of you have noticed this move. The obvious move is rook c8. This is also what came to my mind first. And rook c8 is a good move. The queen moves away to b3. We can bring our own queen up to d7 or play bishop f6 and continue. But we can also try to force a trade of queens. What I'm noticing is that there's contact between pieces. That's something you always have to see. There's contact between the knight on d5 and the bishop on f4, which means queen on c4 is a little bit overextended. But this is a moot point currently because the knight on d5 is pinned. But what if we try to unpin the knight while also offering a queen trade? Well, that wouldn't be such a bad idea, would it? That's how we get the move queen to c8, which I think is very accurate. Because in the event of the queen trade, we also get our rook onto the square that we want it to be on anyway. So we get control of the c-file. If white refrains from the trade, well, white has to stay on the 4th rank. Otherwise, he loses the bishop. And I don't see where the queen can go. If it goes to d4, we could also take the knight on c3. And suddenly, we can snap the knight on f3 off the board and completely ruin white's structure on both sides of the board. Or we could secure the bishop pair. Okay, well, that is just absolute resignation by our opponent. That's pretty sad, because I was looking forward to, to converting the advantage. Now we just get a free point. Yeah, not our opponent's best day, I have to say. So I apologize for that. Yeah, we really didn't do anything in this game to earn the win, but I'll take it. Yeah, that's a bit anticlimactic. And now our opponent starts to think, which is pretty typical. Rook a c1. Okay. Well, let's stay disciplined and let's finish this game off in style. It's not over yet, right? We're up a piece, but if you were playing, you probably wouldn't think, oh, the game is over. We're playing at 2000. Let's try to convert this in style. So first thing, I wouldn't rush with bishop takes f3. This is essentially a move that you can play whenever you want to. So I know some of you are probably itching to take that knight off the board, but I'd like to keep our bishop alive for the time being and save bishop takes f3 for a rainy day. What is our top priority? Again, what do we need to fix in our position? Well, right now, there's only one source of danger, which is the x-ray against our queen. And if you look carefully, it's not even really a source of danger, because the only way to try to exploit it is knight to d5. If the knight goes the other way, note that we have a fork on e2. That's a check, and we pick off the rook. If white plays knight to d5, we can actually take that knight with our bishop. That's why I want to keep the bishop alive. This hits the white queen on b3. that line is very easy to calculate. Rook takes c5, bishop takes b3, and white will lose at the very least another minor piece. So a move that I really like here is actually queen to c5, which I think is not a move that is necessarily on most people's radar. But what I really want to achieve with this move, other than connecting the rooks and getting the queen off of the 8th rank, we're creating a very concrete tactical threat. I want to finish the game on the next move. Who can tell me what threat this move creates? And I've primed you by talking about this move a little bit earlier. Well, not queen g5 because there's the knight on f3, but yeah, you're threatening to take the knight, and after gf, swing the queen over to g5, the king has to run toward the center, and it's going to get hunted down by the queen from g2, and then queen g1 with an immediate checkmating king hunt. And this is very hard to defend against. Rook d7, yeah, and our opponent walks right into it. Bishop takes f3, and the game is over. Because the dark-squared bishop is defended, but that doesn't even matter. And now the final stage of the game, we go after white's king. Here's another check. But as I've talked about in earlier speedrun games, this phase of the game where you're essentially a couple of moves away from checkmate, you're totally winning and you're trying to hunt the king down, is an area where some players actually struggle, particularly newer players. And one thing that often happens is overfixation on trying to deliver checkmate rather than just trying to cash in your chips and win a bunch of material. So that's what we're going to do here. First things first, we can make a couple of no-brainer moves to win another pawn and force white's king even further into confinement. I'm, of course, talking about another check on g1, followed by queen takes f2 check. That forces the king back to d1. And there would be nothing wrong with taking the pawn on f3 with check. Okay, our opponent is just giving up all his pieces. This is obvious without further comments. And finally, I think the rook comes in with checkmate. Rook a c8 check. Notice that the b4 square is under control, so the king would have to go to d4, and e5 would have been made. Yeah, definitely I don't know how to characterize this game. More straightforward than I was expecting from our first battle against a 2,000-plus opponent. But that's how these things go. So where did things go terribly wrong for our opponent? Well, first of all, this whole knight f3 business is essentially unnecessary. Right? If you're already playing this, then go open Sicilian with knight f3. There's no downside to playing the move knight f3. It's not like white is really avoiding anything through this move order, although I faced it quite a bit in tournament play myself. I think the only quote-unquote trap that this move order sets is this move e5, which is what a lot of players would do without knowledge of this line, thinking, oh, well, that's a trap. Knight takes e5, queen a5, deja vu, wins the knight. Unfortunately, after c3, as I was talking about during the game, this is a terrible version of a Smith-Morra. Black is not lost here after d6, but hopefully you're able to see that you've created, these massive light square weaknesses in the center. After bishop c4, white's development advantage becomes very alarming. And if black makes one more careless move, after knight g5, the game is already over because there's just no way to defend f7. So if you've stumbled into this in this position, I believe that the best move is actually to play knight c6. And this transposes into a variation of the Alapin, which is sometimes reached via which is normally reached via the 2e5 move order. This is, by the way, a very legitimate line against the Alapin. It's gotten pretty popular recently. And if white plays d4 here, and after the mass trade on d4, one of the top theoretical moves is bishop c4. And bang, we've transposed directly into that line after knight f6. This is a common position. So instead, you can reach it via the e5, c3, knight c6, cd, ed, and now either bishop c4 or knight takes d4. We've transposed into that Alapin line via this move order. If knight g5 in this position, I don't think this works because black has a check on b4. And the point of that check is actually to get yourself to castle so that you protect the f7 pawn. This is a unique kind of defensive resource that doesn't exist in a lot of positions where you face the fried liver type attack. Also, of course, black has d5 in this position. But here after ed, you do get a very fried livery type situation, and black could get caught in the crossfire very quickly. So in any case, we don't touch the move e5. We don't need that. You can also consider the move d5, but this is unnecessarily theoretical. Just play the move that you normally play, in this case, knight c6. And bishop c4, I think, is a serious mistake. I think this is a very serious mistake, because after knight f6, I don't see a way for white to actually keep material equality any longer. Of course, our opponent overlooked knight takes e5. This was the source of all of white's struggles. But even if white doesn't play e5, what does white play? And it's hard to defend this e4 pawn. If white says, okay, let me go into the open Sicilian, no, we're actually going to take this pawn. And it's worth noting that bishop takes f7 actually might be possible and might even be the best move, with the idea, well, what is white's idea? Who can tell me how white recovers the piece here? And there is a way for white to recover the knight, but it's not what you might think it is. There's also a trap here. So it's not this, right? A lot of you might think it's this. It's not this, because the knight drops back. You actually have to go diagonally. Queen h5, diagonal checks are the hardest checks to block. And after king g8, the queen swings over to d5 and picks up e4. And I think this is a very instructive position. If you're watching on YouTube, you should pause and try to evaluate this. Who do you think is better and why? So I'll let you kind of marinate on that for a second. How would you evaluate this position if you had to give an approximate computer assessment? Who's better and why? So if two people were arguing here, there's sort of two obvious factors, and the question is, well, which of them outweighs the other? From white's perspective, black has this very awkward king on g8 and this awkward situation with the rook on h8 locked in the corner. But that actually pales in importance to black's assets, and black has two major assets. The first is the bishop pair, which is going to become important later on. The second is black's central superiority, which we can really show by playing the move d5, attacking the queen. This forces white's hand. If white takes on c6, then he allows us to further bolster our already monster center. Whereas if white drops the queen back, first of all, this is a very awkward move. This walks into bishop c5, and the engine gives a funny line. Bishop takes, knight takes, bishop takes, and white can't defend the b2 pawn. So that's out of the question. And if the queen goes the other way to d3, this is better, but now this allows e5. And we really unfurl our center. Just look at this center construction, which is incredibly safe. It can be safeguarded further with bishop to d6, bolstering the e5 pawn. No question in my mind that black is clearly better after bishop d6. Is the game over? No. You might say, well, how is black going to solve the problem of the rook in the corner? Well, you can actually bring your king back out to f7, then kind of castle by hand by moving the rook out and tucking the king back on g8. But you don't really need to do that immediately. The rook on h8 is chilling. We don't need the services of the rook just yet. So one of the key takeaways from the games that we're playing at a higher level is that things are no longer going to be one-sided. You have to learn how to look at the position from multiple perspectives. And you have to understand that just because your position has a flaw, particularly a visually arresting flaw, that doesn't mean that you're not better. And that doesn't mean your position's bad. You're most of the time going to have good things and bad things about your position as the games get more complex, and you have to learn how to weigh those factors. And that's one of the hardest things in chess to do, but hopefully this was a little illustration of how to do that better. Questions on this discussion? If black trades queens, yeah, probably black would be close to winning. The engine eval was +1 in black's favor. I mean, it's the chess.com engine, which is kind of weak, but I agree with that assessment. I would say it's about +1 in black's favor. Now, if white does not take on f7, if white just castles, well, then we could grab the center with d5, and there's zero compensation for the pawn. Black is essentially winning. So, yeah, and if white plays, I mean, I guess queen e2 might be the lesser evil, but now the d4 pawn is fully intact, and we can strike at the center again with d5, trade. The engine gives castle, and we could bring our bishop out to g4. Then we could play e6 to support the knight. And again, white has a very hard time recovering the pawn on d4 that he has deliberately not captured. So after e5, the situation is further exacerbated. White loses the second pawn. Our opponent insisted on keeping the material as balanced as possible. This probably is the best move. Again, if white takes, then of course queen a5 picks up the knight and keeps the second extra pawn. And notice that we take on e5 with check, so white, again, can't recapture d4. Okay, so instead, queen takes d4. Hopefully the logic behind knight takes bishop was understandable to people. This is also very good. I considered this approach, but I like this quite a bit less because also the g-file could end up working in white's favor, believe it or not, because it might make it difficult for us to develop our bishop along this diagonal if we're tied down to the g7 pawn. So I much prefer the bishop pair as a long-term advantage as opposed to a superficial weakening of our opponent's kingside, which we can't exploit anyway because we don't have our pieces developed. So knight takes bishop. Now we strike with d5. An important note is that this check seems annoying, but we can just block it with our queen in order to keep b7 protected, so that wouldn't have been dangerous. Queen b3, we continue our development. Somebody was asking, why didn't we play g6? Why did we abandon this idea? Because I think g6 is a little bit too slow. I think we need to prioritize rapid kingside development. I also think that e6 kills two birds with one stone in the sense that it supports the d5 pawn, and the d5 pawn is the pride of our position. We don't want to leave that pawn without sufficient defenders. For instance, after bishop g7, knight c3 castles, well, white could start applying pressure on that pawn with rook d1, and e6 is a little bit awkward. It creates a lot of dark square weaknesses, and I've talked about this many times in the speedrun. In many Sicilian positions, you want to be careful about combining the moves g6 and e6 because you're weakening a whole lot of dark squares. White could try to support, entrench the bishop on e5, and it's just a little bit awkward here. So hopefully that gives you a sense of why we played e6. Flexibility is very important. And the other key takeaway from this position is that, you know, yes, you're blocking the bishop on c8, but you don't have to develop every piece instantly, urgently. You can put some of those tasks off to later on in the middle game after you've completed, let's say, the development of your kingside, which is exactly what we did. We finished the development of our kingside, and now we very calmly solved the problem of our final undeveloped piece with b6. This move kind of exacerbates white's defeat. If I was playing white here, I would try to keep the center closed. I would maybe go knight b to d2 and maybe try to get the knight around to the king side, except there's nothing to attack. Black has 0 targets in our position that white can attack. White doesn't have anything to latch onto, so we would have just kept improving our position, you know, with rook c8 and maybe sticking the knight into the center on e4. That would be another possibility. So, you know, black is winning here from a technical standpoint. No question about it, but white definitely could have continued the game longer. Yeah, c4 just walks into our hands because it opens up the position. That favors the side that has the bishop pair in this case. Again, note that this endgame might have been the best way for white to prolong his agony, but black just has everything that we could possibly ask for here. We would have played knight d5. These pawns are now weak, and the a file is nothing to be concerned about because we could just stick our pawn on a5 and build a little pawn chain and free up our rook. So, you know, in any case, queen c2, we stick the knight in the center, we bring the bishop out, and queen c8, I think, is a really instructive move because we don't just play the most obvious move in the position, which would have been rook c8, which would have been perfectly fine. We use contact between pieces to force the queens off the board. White should have taken on c8. We would have taken maybe with the a rook, maybe with a c rook, and we would have reached this endgame, which is, again, technically winning for black. No question about it. This bishop is a monster. We're up a pawn. The other bishop's coming out to f6. The rook is diving into c2, and white can't stop everything at the same time. Also because white's constantly dealing with problems related to the a pawn. Again, contact between pieces. You can dig around in this endgame if you want to learn a little bit about endgame technique, but hopefully you can understand that black's essentially completely winning here. Okay, so queen b3, knight takes f4. We have nothing to discuss after that. The only alternative that was semi-viable would have been queen a4. And here we would have had a choice between grabbing the like complete bishop pair, 2 bishops versus 2 knights, and then maybe building a queen bishop battery against g2. More probably, I would have taken twice on c3. And I don't see a downside to that because rook d7 fails. The a1 rook is hanging. And this is not really an initiative. We could just drop our queen on a3. And after the trade, we are now up 2 pawns. This is not scary. 1 rook on the 7th rank isn't going to make any difference, especially because the other isn't able to access d7. And again, at this point, the win is a matter of very straightforward technique. We go rook fc8. We get the other pair of rooks off the board, and we win straightforwardly. So, yeah, a pretty dry game, unfortunately. After the bishop was blundered, there is nothing left to talk about. But does anybody have any questions about the course of the game? Yeah, this is simple positional chess, and these are the kinds of games that you're actually going to end up winning. I think the speedrun gives you a realistic portrayal of what games at each level looks like, and not every game is going to be super glamorous, super rich, and super full of tactical ideas. You need to know how to beat players who are playing badly and how to do it efficiently. And the best way to do it is to play simple, straightforward positional chess. So, thank you all.